When people hear the word Vikings, they often imagine loud warriors wearing horned helmets, shouting and running into battle, but that image is mostly modern fiction, because the real Viking world was much wider and more ordinary, and it included farmers, fishermen, traders, craftsmen, travelers, settlers, and sometimes warriors, meaning that the Viking Age was not simply a time of constant fighting, but a long period where everyday life and long-distance movement slowly changed the map of Europe and beyond. The Vikings came from Scandinavia, which is the northern region that includes what we now call Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, and even though these areas are often grouped together, they were not identical places, because Norway had a coastline full of fjords and mountains where farmland could be limited and coastal travel mattered a lot. Sweden had forests, lakes, and river routes that opened paths toward the east. And Denmark had flatter land that made farming and local power centers easier to build. So from the beginning it helps to think of the Viking world as a connected northern zone with different local strengths rather than one single uniform culture. Even the word Viking can be confusing, because in some historical contexts it refers more to an activity than to a nationality, meaning it could describe someone going on a sea expedition, a raid, or a trading journey. So not every Scandinavian person was automatically a Viking, but during the Viking Age many seafaring groups from Scandinavia became famous in Europe because they were highly mobile, sometimes violent, sometimes commercial, and often capable of doing both within the same generation. Most of what we know about Vikings comes from a mix of sources, and one large part of the information comes from the people who met them and wrote about them, such as English, Frankish, Irish, or Byzantine writers who often described Viking attacks with fear and anger, because sudden coastal raids felt like chaos arriving from the sea. And another part comes from Scandinavian stories and sagas that were preserved orally and later written down, which means they can contain real memories mixed with legends and dramatic details. And then archaeology becomes very important because it gives us physical evidence like ship remains, tools, graves, jewelry, weapons, coins, weights used in trade, and traces of houses that show how ordinary Viking life actually looked. To understand why Vikings began traveling so widely, it helps to look at Europe in the late 8th and early 9th centuries, because many regions were politically divided and defenses along long coastlines were not always strong, and many monasteries held wealth in the form of silver, food, and valuable objects while having little protection, which created targets that were both attractive and vulnerable. And at the same time Viking ships could arrive quickly, land fast, take what they wanted, and leave before any organized resistance could respond in time. The ships themselves were one of the biggest reasons Vikings could do what they did, because the longships were designed for speed and flexibility, using both sails and oars, capable of crossing open sea but also capable of moving through shallow waters and up rivers, which meant Vikings could travel far inland and strike places that did not expect danger from the water. And in some cases ships could even be dragged short distances across land to connect river systems, making the movement network even more powerful than it looked on a simple map. The question of why this happened during this particular time has several reasons rather than one single trigger, because in parts of Scandinavia land and resources could be limited, and in some inheritance systems younger sons might end up with fewer opportunities at home, which could push people to seek wealth elsewhere, and the wider European economy was also becoming more connected, with silver becoming a key measure of wealth and status, meaning that raids and trade both offered access to the same valuable resource, and political changes like the weakening and fragmentation of large kingdoms in Western Europe could reduce coordinated coastal defense, and when these factors combined with ship technology and navigation experience, the result was a period where long-distance expeditions became both possible and profitable. One of the most famous early events often used to symbolize the start of the Viking Age is the raid on Lindisfarne in 793, a monastery on the coast of England, because it shocked Christian writers and became a powerful story that spread through chronicles, but the larger reality was that this raid was part of a growing pattern, and after it there were more attacks and then more organized campaigns. And over time Vikings began staying for longer periods, building camps, wintering in foreign lands, and in some regions eventually settling and creating new communities instead of simply returning home after a short raid. It is also important to remember that Viking movement did not only go westward toward England, Ireland, and France, because large groups also moved eastward from Scandinavia, especially through Swedish routes across the Baltic Sea and into river systems that led deep into Eastern Europe, where trade networks connected the north to the lands that later became Russia and Ukraine and then to the Black Sea. And through these routes some Scandinavians reached Byzantium, where they could serve as elite guards and mercenaries, meaning that the Viking world was both Atlantic and Eurasian at the same time, stretching in different directions depending on geography and opportunity. When we shift away from raids and focus on daily life, the Viking world starts looking less like a battlefield and more like a rural society built around survival, seasons, and work, because most people were not constantly traveling, and many lived in longhouses made of wood, turf, and stone, where families shared space and where animals might also be kept close in winter for warmth and practicality. And the inside of these homes could be smoky and dim because fire was central for heat and cooking, and life followed a rhythm shaped by weather, storage of food, and the need to prepare for long cold periods. Food in the Viking Age was often simple and based on what could be reliably produced or stored, meaning grains, dairy, fish, and preserved meat were important, and preservation methods like drying, smoking, salting, and fermenting helped people survive through winter, and clothing was usually made from wool and linen and designed for warmth and durability rather than fashion, although people did value appearance and personal items, which is visible in the jewelry and combs found in graves and settlements. Viking society had social layers, including enslaved people, free farmers, and elites who controlled more wealth and military power, but the structure could vary from place to place, and in many regions free farmers were a strong class that participated in local assemblies and legal systems, and because centralized government was limited, social order relied heavily on reputation, family alliances, and a system of law and compensation where conflicts could be resolved through negotiated payments or sometimes through long rivalries, meaning that honor and public standing played a major role in how communities stayed stable. Religion and belief also shaped Viking culture, especially before the full spread of Christianity, with gods like Odin and Thor forming part of a worldview that included stories about fate, bravery, the afterlife, and cosmic order. But it is important not to reduce Viking behavior to religion alone, because economic goals, political ambition, and local conditions often mattered more in deciding whether someone became a raider, trader, settler, or all of these at different times, and as Vikings interacted with Christian Europe, belief systems changed gradually and unevenly, with conversion happening through trade, diplomacy, and royal decisions, creating a long transition rather than a sudden switch. By the end of this first part, the main idea is simple and calm, because the Vikings were not a mysterious fantasy group but real northern societies shaped by a challenging environment and strong maritime skills, and their expansion was driven by practical reasons like opportunity, wealth, and mobility, and while raids created fear and dramatic stories, the larger Viking Age was also about movement, settlement, trade, law, daily work, and slow cultural change, which is why it can support a very long, detailed history told in a steady and quiet tone. Most Viking Age people did not wake up thinking about war or travel, because for the majority of families life was shaped by very ordinary needs, like keeping warm, keeping animals alive, protecting food stores, repairing tools, and preparing for the next season. And this simple reality is important to remember because it explains why Viking society could produce both long-distance explorers and also millions of quiet days where nothing dramatic happened except work, weather, and the slow passing of time. A typical Viking settlement could be small, sometimes just a cluster of farm buildings and a few families living close enough to share labor and protection, and sometimes larger villages existed where trade and craftwork became more active, but the overall pattern was still rural and spread out, meaning people often lived near the land they worked, near water for fishing or transport, and near forests for wood, hunting, and fuel. And because Scandinavian geography includes long coastlines, rivers, and many natural routes, the distance between places could feel shorter by boat than by land, which made water travel part of normal life even before long overseas expeditions became famous. The main building in many households was the longhouse, which could be built from timber frames, stone foundations, and walls packed with turf, and the roof might be made from wooden supports covered in grass and soil or other materials that helped insulation, and inside the longhouse the space was practical rather than comfortable, with a central fire that provided heat and cooking but also produced smoke, and with benches, storage areas, and work zones arranged along the sides, and sometimes animals were kept in an attached area or nearby building, especially during harsh winters, because keeping livestock alive was a form of wealth and survival rather than a luxury. Light inside the home could be limited, especially in winter, because days were short and windows were small or absent. So much of the indoor atmosphere depended on firelight, oil lamps, and the reflective surfaces of pale wood, and even then the interior could feel dim, and the air could carry the smell of smoke, food, wet wool, and the natural materials of daily life. And while this may sound uncomfortable to modern people, it was normal for the time and it worked well enough to keep families alive through a climate that could be cold and unforgiving. Work in the Viking world was constant and seasonal, because spring and summer demanded planting, repairing fences, gathering building materials, and preparing for travel or trade, while autumn demanded harvesting, storing food, slaughtering animals at the right time, and preserving meat, and winter demanded maintenance, craftwork, storytelling, small repairs, and careful use of supplies. Meaning that even though a household might look simple from the outside, it was actually a busy system where every action mattered, and where wasted resources could turn into hunger later. Food was built around what the environment allowed, and while Viking feasts are famous in stories, everyday meals were usually plain and practical, with grains like barley, rye, and oats forming the base for bread, porridge, and simple baked foods, and dairy products being important because cattle, goats, and sheep provided milk that could be turned into butter, cheese, and other preserved forms. And fish was a reliable resource in coastal and river regions, often eaten fresh but also dried or smoked for storage, and meat from livestock existed but could not always be consumed freely because animals were valuable for breeding, labor, and long-term security. Preserving food was one of the most important skills in the Viking Age, because a family that could store enough calories and protein would survive winter better than a family that could not, and preservation methods included drying fish and meat in cold winds, smoking food to keep it longer, salting when salt could be obtained or produced, fermenting certain products, and storing grains in safe containers protected from moisture and rodents, and this careful planning created a slow rhythm in the household where much of the year was about preparing for the months when fresh resources would be limited. Clothing was also shaped by practicality and climate, and most garments were made from wool and linen, with wool being especially important because it provided warmth even when conditions were wet, and clothing had to survive constant movement, work, and repeated use, so it was not disposable, it was repaired often, and it was made to last, and people might wear tunics, trousers, dresses, cloaks, and leather shoes. And for warmth they used layers and thick fabrics, and even though the general idea was simple, people still cared about appearance, because small details like belts, pins, brooches, and carefully made items showed status and personal identity. The production of cloth itself was a major labor process, because it required raising sheep, shearing wool, cleaning it, spinning it into thread, weaving it into fabric, and then sewing it into clothing, and this means that textiles were valuable, and that much of the quiet work in Viking households involved making and maintaining cloth, and in many communities women played a central role in these processes. Although men also participated depending on the task and local customs, and this system shows that Viking life was built on invisible labor that did not look heroic but was essential. Family structure in Viking society could be complex, but the household was the core unit, and families depended on each other for work, protection, and reputation, and marriage could be both personal and political, because alliances mattered, property mattered, and the future of children mattered, and while romantic stories exist in later literature, the everyday reality was that marriage was often tied to stability, inheritance, and social bonds, and the household needed cooperation to survive, especially in a world where nature could quickly punish unprepared people. Children grew up in an environment where work and learning were mixed, because they would gradually take part in tasks like caring for animals, helping with fishing, gathering firewood, or assisting in craft work, and education was mostly practical rather than formal, meaning children learned by watching and doing, and stories, songs, and oral traditions served as entertainment but also as a way to pass knowledge, values, and community memory from one generation to the next. Social status existed and could shape daily life strongly, because not everyone in the Viking world had the same freedom, and enslaved people were a real part of the economy, used for labor in households, farms, and sometimes as traded goods in wider networks, and free farmers had more rights and could participate in local decisions, and elites had greater wealth and influence, which could come from land ownership, leadership in war, control of trade routes, or political alliances, and these layers meant that daily routine could look different depending on where a person stood in the social structure. Craftwork was everywhere in Viking communities, because tools and objects needed constant replacement and repair, and blacksmiths produced nails, knives, axes, and farming equipment, and woodworkers built ships, carts, bowls, and buildings, and leatherworkers created shoes and belts, and bone and antler could be shaped into small useful items like combs and needle cases. And jewelry makers produced decorative pieces that could also function as displays of wealth, and because long-distance trade existed, materials and styles could travel, meaning that a small item found in a village could sometimes show connections to distant regions. Trade itself was not separate from ordinary life, because even if a family was mostly focused on survival, it still benefited from exchanging goods, and the Viking world used systems of weight and silver, where people measured value using scales and standardized weights, and this is why archaeologists often find weights and pieces of silver that were cut into smaller parts, because value could be carried and divided. And markets could appear in coastal sites where local people met travelers, and where news, products, and social contact moved along with material wealth. The quiet logic of daily life also explains how the Vikings could travel so far, because long voyages required planning, supplies, and reliable ships, and a society that could organize work, produce durable clothing, preserve food, maintain tools, and cooperate within households was a society that could support seafaring expeditions, and even if only a portion of the population went overseas, the rest of the community created the stable base that made such travel possible. At the end of this part, the important feeling to keep is that Viking life was not non-stop action, but a steady routine of work and preparation, where the longhouse was a center of warmth and labor, where food was stored carefully, where clothing was made slowly by hand, and where families built a system strong enough to survive winter and strong enough to support travel when opportunity appeared. Which is why the Viking Age can be told as a long, calm story about ordinary people living in a harsh environment, slowly becoming part of a wider world. The Viking Age is difficult to understand without ships, because the ship was not only a vehicle for war or exploration, but also a tool of everyday connection, trade, and identity, and in a region where coastlines, islands, fjords, and rivers shaped movement more than roads did, a ship could be as normal as a cart, and for many people it was simply the most practical way to travel, carry goods, visit relatives, reach markets, and sometimes leave home to seek something better. The famous Viking longship was not one single design but a family of related designs, and the details could change depending on purpose, because some ships were built for speed and raids, some were built for transporting people and goods, and some were built for longer voyages where storage space mattered more than quick landings, and in all of these forms the ship represented a balance between lightness and strength. Because a ship that was too heavy would be slow and difficult to maneuver, while a ship that was too light could be damaged by rough water, and Viking shipbuilders became skilled at creating that balance through materials, structure, and experience. One key feature of many Viking ships was the clinker-built method, where planks overlapped like scales, creating a flexible hull that could handle waves and stress without snapping as easily as a rigid structure might, and this kind of construction helped ships survive a wide range of conditions, from coastal waters and river travel to longer sea crossings, and while it may sound like a technical detail, it mattered in practice because it supported the central Viking advantage, which was mobility, and mobility is often the difference between danger and safety, profit and failure, survival and loss. Another important feature was the combination of sail and oars, because a ship that can only rely on wind becomes helpless when the wind is wrong, and a ship that can only rely on rowing becomes slow and exhausting over long distances, but a ship that can use both can adapt, switching between steady rowing during calm or narrow water travel and fast sailing when wind conditions are favorable. And this meant Viking crews could plan routes more intelligently, travel farther, and react quickly. When they needed to leave a coast before enemies gathered. The shallow draft of many Viking ships also mattered a lot, because it allowed ships to move through waters that were too shallow for many other vessels, and it allowed them to approach beaches directly without needing a deep harbor, which made landing simple and fast, and this is part of why early raids were effective, because a crew could sail close, jump out, do what they came to do, and return to the ship quickly, and it also allowed them to travel upriver, turning rivers into highways. That carried Viking groups into the interior of a region where people did not expect a threat from the water. But ships were not just for raids, and it is important to repeat that calmly, because the same ship that could bring armed men to a monastery could also bring traders to a market, migrants to a new settlement, or families to an island where they wanted to build farms, and this dual purpose is one reason the Viking story is so large, because it is not just a military story, it is also a story of movement, trade, settlement, and connection, and the ship is the quiet technology that makes it all possible. Building a ship required resources and cooperation, because timber had to be selected, cut, shaped, and fitted, and good shipbuilding timber was not random wood, it needed to be strong, reliable, and shaped in ways that made construction efficient, and iron was needed for rivets and nails, and tar or similar substances were needed to seal wood and protect it from water, and this means shipbuilding depended on forests, craftsmen, blacksmiths, and organized labor, which again shows that Viking expeditions were supported by ordinary economic systems and long-term planning rather than only personal bravery. A ship also needed a crew, and crew work was both physical and social, because rowing required rhythm, coordination, and endurance, while sailing required understanding wind and balance, and a crew that could not cooperate would not travel far, and life at sea could involve long hours of repetitive movement, wet clothing, cold winds, and limited comfort, meaning that even if a voyage became famous later, the experience itself might have felt slow, tiring, and routine for those involved, with much of the time spent simply watching the horizon and keeping the ship steady. Navigation during the Viking Age did not involve modern maps and instruments, but it did involve experience and observation, because sailors could use the sun and stars, the shape of coastlines, the direction of winds, the movement of waves, and the behavior of birds to judge location and direction, and coastal travel often involved staying within sight of land when possible, moving from familiar point to familiar point, while longer crossings required careful timing, knowledge of seasonal conditions, and confidence in the ship's ability to survive open water. It is likely that many Viking routes became established through repetition, because once a crew successfully traveled a path and returned home, that knowledge became part of the community, and future crews could follow the same sequence of stops, islands, and coastlines, and over time these routes formed networks, where certain ports and river points became common meeting places, and where news, goods, and people moved repeatedly, creating patterns that look almost like early trade highways across water. When Vikings traveled west toward places like the British Isles, the North Sea became a central space, and it is important to understand the North Sea not as a barrier but as a road, because for experienced sailors water is not necessarily a wall, it can be a faster route than land travel, and the sea connected Scandinavia to England, Scotland, Ireland, and the continent in a way that allowed quick movement compared to traveling across forests and mountains, and this is why islands, coastal towns, and river mouths became important points where Viking activity concentrated. When Vikings traveled east, rivers played a similar role, because river systems allowed movement deep into Eastern Europe, and a crew could travel by boat along waterways, carry goods, and sometimes portage the ship across short land stretches to connect one river to another, and this made travel possible across huge distances without needing roads in the modern sense. And along these routes Vikings could connect the Baltic region to inland markets and eventually to the Black Sea and Byzantium, forming long chains of exchange that moved silver, furs, wax, weapons, and people. The logistics of travel were not glamorous, because supplies mattered more than drama, and long voyages required food that could survive storage, like dried fish, preserved meat, grain-based foods, and water or drink that could be carried safely, and crews had to think about weather, because storms could ruin a voyage, delay a landing, or damage a ship, and even in good conditions the sea could be exhausting, because everything becomes harder when clothing is wet, hands are cold, and work continues regardless of comfort. Ships also represented social status and wealth, because building and maintaining a good vessel required resources, and a leader who could gather a crew and sail confidently could gain prestige, and this created a culture where seafaring success supported political influence, and political influence supported more seafaring success, creating a cycle where mobility and power grew together. And this cycle helps explain why some Viking leaders became famous, because successful expeditions provided wealth, and wealth provided loyalty, and loyalty provided the ability to organize larger ventures. At the same time, it is important to keep the story calm and realistic, because not every voyage was successful, and many journeys likely ended with storms, losses, ship damage, or failure to find profit, and even successful raids or trades could be risky, because foreign lands were unfamiliar, local enemies could gather quickly, and a crew far from home had limited support. Meaning that the Viking Age involved many quiet failures that did not enter heroic stories, even though those failures were part of the real human experience of long-distance travel. As Viking groups began settling in foreign lands, ships became not only tools of arrival but tools of connection, because settlers could still rely on travel routes to maintain contact with home, bring goods, bring family members, and maintain identity across distance, and in places like Iceland and Greenland, the ability to travel by sea meant that remote communities could exist at all, even if communication was slow and risky, and this shows again how the ship is not just a symbol of raiding, but a foundation of colonization and survival. By the end of this third part, the main point is steady and clear, because Viking expansion was not magic, and it was not only violence, it was the practical result of ship technology, skilled craftwork, shared knowledge of routes, and a society that could support long travel through routine preparation. And when we imagine a Viking ship moving across gray water under a quiet sky, it is often less like a dramatic movie and more like a long, repetitive, disciplined journey where the crew simply keeps going, hour after hour, because movement itself is the engine of the Viking world. The religion of the Viking Age is often presented in a dramatic way, full of thunder, heroic death, and powerful gods, but in everyday reality belief was usually calmer and more practical than the stories suggest, because for most people religion was not only about battles and fate, it was also about weather, harvests, safety, family health, social order, and the feeling that life had patterns and forces beyond human control, and in a world where storms could destroy ships, winters could kill animals, and disease could spread without explanation, belief systems provided meaning, structure, and comfort. Before Christianity became dominant in Scandinavia, many Viking communities followed what we call Old Norse religion, a system of gods, spirits, stories, and rituals that evolved over time and that varied by region, because there was no single central church with one fixed doctrine, and different areas could emphasize different practices, and the religion was mostly maintained through oral tradition, community habits, and local leaders rather than through formal written scripture, which means it was flexible, changeable, and closely tied to social life. The best-known gods in this belief system include Odin, Thor, and Freya, and each of them represented different parts of the world and different human needs, because Odin was associated with wisdom, poetry, knowledge, leadership, and the deeper mysteries of life and death, while Thor was associated with strength, protection, thunder, and the everyday safety of ordinary people, and Freya was associated with love, fertility, wealth, and complex ideas of power and desire, and these gods were not only characters in stories, they were also symbols of what people valued and feared, making them part of the emotional landscape of daily life. Many Norse myths describe a world that is connected and layered, with gods, humans, and other beings existing within a larger structure often imagined as multiple realms, and one famous concept is the world tree, Yggdrasil, which represents the idea that existence is not simple and flat, but connected through deep roots and branches, and while modern people might read this as fantasy, for Viking Age listeners these stories could function as a way to think about order, danger, and meaning. Because myth is often a practical tool for understanding a world that cannot be fully controlled. Rituals in Viking religion often centered on giving and exchange, because many communities believed that the relationship with divine powers involved offering something in return for protection or success, and this could include food, drink, objects, or symbolic acts, and these offerings might be done at specific places like sacred groves, special stones, springs, or community gathering points. And sometimes they could be linked to seasonal events like the start of winter, the return of spring, or the time of harvest, which meant religion was woven into the calendar of survival and work. One common concept in Norse practice is the idea of a blot, a ritual offering, and although the details could vary, the basic pattern involved community participation, a shared meal or ceremony, and the belief that the act strengthened bonds between humans and the powers they respected, and it also strengthened bonds between people themselves, because rituals are not only spiritual events, they are social events, and they create unity by making everyone part of the same moment, the same rules, and the same shared purpose. It is easy to focus on dramatic topics like sacrifice and death, but a calmer approach shows that for most people the everyday religious life could be simple, involving spoken words, small offerings, respect for certain places, and habits passed down through families, and even small acts like wearing an amulet or marking a tool with a symbol might carry meaning, because these gestures could represent protection, luck, or identity. And when we find objects like Thor's hammer pendants in archaeological contexts, it suggests that people carried belief with them in quiet, portable forms, not always in large public ceremonies. The Viking view of death is often described through ideas like Valhalla, the hall where fallen warriors are taken, but it is important to understand that not every person expected this heroic afterlife, and not every death was considered heroic, because most people died from ordinary causes like illness, accidents, hunger, and aging, and the religious response to death included respect for ancestors, the importance of burial rituals, and the belief that the dead still mattered to the living. Sometimes as protectors, sometimes as memories, and sometimes as social forces through inheritance and reputation. Burial practices varied widely, which again shows the flexibility of the religion and culture, because some people were buried in simple graves with modest items, while others were buried with wealth, weapons, tools, and jewelry, and in some cases ships were used in burial ceremonies, either real ships or symbolic representations, and these practices were not only about the afterlife, they were also about social status, family pride, and public storytelling, because a burial is a moment when a community decides how it wants to remember a person, and that memory becomes part of social reality. Religion also shaped values like honor, loyalty, and reputation, not necessarily because the gods demanded violence, but because in a world without strong centralized authority, social order depended on people taking promises seriously and protecting their standing, and mythic stories reinforced the idea that actions had consequences, that betrayal was dangerous, and that courage was admired. And this could influence the way people acted in disputes, alliances, and family politics, meaning that belief and society supported each other in a quiet feedback loop. Another important part of Norse religion was storytelling itself, because poems and sagas were not just entertainment, they were a way of storing cultural memory, teaching values, and making sense of the world, and poets could hold an important place in society because their words could shape reputations and preserve history, and even if many stories were exaggerated, the act of telling them created a shared identity. And identity is a form of power, because it helps people cooperate, trust each other, and understand what it means to belong to a group. As the Viking Age progressed, Christianity began to spread into Scandinavia, and this did not happen overnight, because conversion is rarely a sudden event for an entire society, and it often involves long periods of mixed belief, political negotiation, and cultural change. And many Viking leaders adopted Christianity partly for spiritual reasons but also because it offered connections to powerful Christian kingdoms, access to diplomacy, and new forms of legitimacy, and over time churches were built, Christian burial practices spread, and older rituals were slowly pushed aside or transformed. This transition created a period where people might live between belief systems, keeping some older habits while adopting new religious identity, and this can be seen in objects that mix symbols, or in stories where pagan and Christian ideas overlap, and it reminds us that Viking culture was not frozen in one form, but constantly adapting to changing conditions, which is one reason it lasted so long and influenced so many regions. By the end of this part, the calm conclusion is that Norse religion was not simply a violent cult of war, but a living system of stories and practices that helped people face uncertainty, organize community life, and find meaning in a difficult environment. And while gods like Odin and Thor became famous in later imagination, the real impact of belief was often quiet, appearing in daily routines, seasonal rituals, personal objects, and the long human need to feel that life is connected to something larger than immediate survival. When the Viking Age is described in older European writings, it often begins with shock, because the early raids felt sudden to the people who experienced them, and even though violence and conflict existed in Europe long before the Vikings arrived, there was something uniquely unsettling about enemies appearing from the sea with little warning, striking fast, and disappearing again before a strong response could form. And this sense of helplessness is what made the earliest Viking encounters so memorable in chronicles, letters, and religious records. One of the most famous early events used as a symbolic starting point is the raid on Lindisfarne in 793, a monastery on the northeastern coast of England, and the reason this particular raid became so famous is not because it was the first act of violence in history, but because monasteries were seen as holy, protected places where prayer and learning existed far away from ordinary war. And when armed men attacked such a place, killed people, took valuables, and left, the emotional impact was intense, and writers described it as a disaster that felt almost supernatural, as if the world had become unstable and unsafe. But it is important to understand that Lindisfarne was not an isolated event, and even before 793 there were smaller encounters and signs of northern sea raiders, and after 793 there were many more attacks, sometimes on monasteries, sometimes on small settlements, and sometimes on coastal towns, and these raids were not always identical in size or outcome, because some were small quick strikes and others involved larger groups, and the pattern grew over time as knowledge spread, because once a route was known and a target was proven vulnerable, other crews could follow the same path and expect similar results. From the point of view of the raiders, early raids were practical actions, not just chaos, because the goal was usually to gain wealth quickly, take portable valuables, and return safely, and monasteries were attractive because they often held silver, religious objects, and stored goods, while having limited defensive forces, and because coastal monasteries were accessible by ship, the raid could be timed carefully, arriving when resistance was minimal, taking what could be carried, and leaving before local leaders could gather men for pursuit. The speed of this process mattered more than dramatic fighting, because the Viking advantage was not that they were magically stronger than everyone else, but that their ships and planning allowed them to choose when to appear and when to vanish. And in an era where communication was slow and regional armies were not always ready, a fast raid could succeed even against a population that was not weak in general, simply because the defenders had no time to organize, and this is why early chroniclers describe the raids as terrifying even when the raids themselves may have lasted only a short time. Another reason early Viking raids spread was that Europe at the time had many political divisions, and not every region had a stable system for coastal defense, and in England there were multiple kingdoms rather than one unified state, meaning that one kingdom might suffer while another remained temporarily safe, and in the Frankish world political power was also complicated, with internal disputes and shifts of authority, which created moments where local defenses were less organized, and Viking groups could exploit these moments, not necessarily because they understood every political detail, but because they could see the practical outcome, which was weak response and easier access to wealth. In the early stages, raids often occurred during warmer months when travel was safer and seas were more predictable, and then raiders would return home before winter, because winter sea travel could be dangerous, and because crews needed to go back to their own farms and communities, and this seasonal pattern made raids feel like a recurring storm, appearing, causing damage, and then disappearing again. And over time some regions began trying to strengthen defenses, building watch systems, organizing local forces, and preparing coastal responses, but these changes took time, and the Viking advantage remained strong while those systems were still developing. The transition from small raids to larger organized campaigns happened gradually, and one important step in this transition was the development of larger fleets that could stay longer, because if a group could remain abroad for an extended period, it could raid more targets, learn local geography better, and pressure communities into paying tribute or making agreements, and by the middle of the Viking Age, many Viking groups were not only raiding, but also demanding payments, controlling towns, and using foreign lands as bases, which meant the relationship between Vikings and local populations became more complex than simple attack and retreat. In England, this complexity is often linked to the arrival of larger forces sometimes described as the Great Heathen Army, and while exact numbers are difficult to know, the impact was real because Viking groups began capturing territory, wintering in England, and shaping political changes, and when Vikings stayed through winter, it showed that they were no longer limited by seasonal raiding patterns. Because wintering required stable camps, supply systems, and the ability to negotiate, intimidate, or cooperate with local communities to survive until spring. At this stage, the Viking presence could create different outcomes depending on local conditions, because sometimes Vikings destroyed a place, sometimes they took tribute and left it functioning, and sometimes they settled and became part of the region's population, and these outcomes depended on leadership decisions, resistance levels, economic value of the region, and the long-term goals of the raiding group. And this is why the Viking Age cannot be reduced to a single behavior, because it was a wide range of strategies used across decades. In the Frankish regions, Viking raids often followed rivers like the Seine and the Loire, because rivers allowed deep access inland, and a ship could move far beyond the coast, reaching places that felt protected before the Viking era, and cities that were not prepared for water-based attacks became vulnerable, and sometimes Vikings even targeted major towns, forcing rulers to respond through military action, payments, or political deals, and this created a long period of tension where local leaders had to balance defense costs with the economic damage caused by repeated raids. The payments made to Vikings in exchange for peace are sometimes referred to as tribute systems, and while it might seem humiliating, such payments were often pragmatic decisions made by rulers who wanted to buy time, avoid destruction, or redirect Viking attention elsewhere, and from the Viking perspective tribute could be just as valuable as plunder, because it was a controlled gain that reduced risk. And once tribute became an option, it could encourage repeated demands, because a group that discovered it could gain wealth without fighting would likely return. However, it is also important to remember that Viking raids were not always successful, and many crews likely faced resistance, storms, failed attacks, and losses, and those failures are not always recorded as clearly as the dramatic successes, because history tends to preserve what shocked and changed things, not what ended quietly, and yet those failures were part of the real cost of raiding, and they shaped Viking decisions over time, pushing some groups toward trade, settlement, or new routes. The human reality of early raids also included interactions that were not purely violent, because once Vikings had repeated contact with foreign regions, they began learning languages, understanding markets, forming alliances, and developing relationships that could involve marriage or shared interests, and even in a violent period, people still traded, talked, and adapted. meaning that the Viking Age was not a constant war but a long process of contact where violence was one tool among many. By the end of this part, the calm conclusion is that the first Viking raids became famous because they were fast, surprising, and emotionally shocking to the societies that experienced them, but behind the fear there was a practical pattern driven by mobility, opportunity, and political fragmentation, and as the pattern repeated, it grew into larger campaigns, winter camps, and eventually settlement, turning what began as scattered attacks into a long historical wave that reshaped coastlines, kingdoms, and daily life across wide regions. It is easy to think of Vikings only as raiders, because raids created fear and dramatic stories, but trade was just as important, and in many ways it was the more stable and lasting part of Viking expansion, because trade created connections that could survive beyond a single season, and it produced wealth through repeated exchange rather than through one-time violence, and as Viking communities traveled farther, they did not only look for targets to attack, they also looked for places to buy, sell, negotiate, and build relationships that could continue year after year. The Viking Age existed inside a wider medieval world where wealth was increasingly measured and moved through networks, and in these networks silver played a central role, because silver could be carried, divided, tested, weighed, and exchanged across different regions even when coins from one kingdom were not accepted in another, and this made silver a universal language of value. And it also explains why Vikings cared so much about silver, because whether they gained it through raids, tribute, or trade, it could be used for status, gifts, payments to followers, and practical buying power. Many Viking communities used systems based on weight rather than on fixed coin values, meaning they used scales and standardized weights to measure how much silver was present, and this is why archaeologists often find small weights and pieces of silver in Viking contexts, because people would cut silver into smaller pieces when needed, creating what is sometimes called hack silver, which sounds rough and primitive, but was actually a flexible system that worked well in a world where different coin systems existed and where trust depended on material value rather than on official stamp designs. Markets and trading centers developed in places that were easy to reach by water, because water routes were the main highways of the Viking world, and coastal towns, river mouths, and sheltered bays naturally became meeting points, and some sites grew into important trade hubs where merchants, craftsmen, and travelers gathered regularly, and in these places you could find goods from many directions, meaning that a market in Scandinavia might contain items that came from the British Isles, the Frankish world, the Baltic region, or even the Islamic world through long chains of exchange. One reason Viking trade networks became so wide is that the Viking world sat between multiple zones, because to the west there were rich coastal societies and growing kingdoms, to the east there were long river routes leading to major trade civilizations, and to the south there were established markets and coin economies, and Scandinavia itself had valuable products that others wanted, such as furs, walrus ivory, amber, timber, and sometimes specialized craft items, and because Vikings were skilled at travel, they could act as connectors moving goods between regions that did not easily connect on their own. In the west, Vikings traded with the British Isles and the Frankish world, and items like cloth, metalwork, wine, and refined goods could enter Viking markets, while Scandinavian products and captured wealth could flow outward, and in the east, Vikings interacted with Slavic and steppe regions, moving along routes that connected to the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And these routes eventually linked into Islamic trade networks where silver coins were produced in large quantities, which is one reason so many Islamic silver coins have been found in Viking-related contexts, because long-distance commerce carried them northward over time. The travel routes that supported this trade were often built around rivers, and in the Eastern world especially, rivers functioned as major transportation systems, and Viking groups could move from the Baltic into river systems like the Dnieper and Volga routes, using portage when necessary, and these paths required knowledge, negotiation with local communities, and sometimes force, meaning trade could involve cooperation. But it could also involve intimidation, tolls, and conflict depending on circumstances. Trade also encouraged the growth of specialized roles inside Viking society, because a community that wants regular commerce needs people who can craft goods, repair ships, measure value, store products, and protect routes, and this created a world where not everyone was a fighter, and many people focused on skills like metalworking, woodworking, leatherworking, jewelry making, and ship maintenance. And over time such skills could become part of family identity and local reputation, turning certain settlements into places known for certain types of production. The social meaning of wealth in the Viking Age is important, because wealth was not only for comfort, it was also for building loyalty, and leaders often gained power by distributing gifts, hosting feasts, paying followers, and showing that they could provide success, and silver and trade goods became tools for this social system. Because a leader who controlled trade routes or who returned from voyages with valuable goods could strengthen their position, attract more followers, and plan larger expeditions, which again shows that economics and politics were linked in a slow cycle. In many Viking contexts, the boundary between trade and raiding was not always clear, because the same group might trade peacefully in one season and raid in another, or trade in one area while raiding elsewhere, and this is not as strange as it seems, because in a world with limited government control, violence and commerce could exist close together, and people could shift behavior depending on opportunity, risk, and local defense, meaning that Viking activity was often opportunistic rather than ideological. One of the most uncomfortable realities of Viking trade networks is that slavery was part of them, because enslaved people were used for labor within Scandinavian households and farms, and they were also traded as goods within wider networks, and captives could be taken during raids or through local conflicts, and then sold along trade routes, and while this topic can be emotionally difficult, it must be included because it was a real part of the medieval economy, and it affected many lives in ways that were rarely recorded from the perspective of those who suffered. The existence of slavery also connects to the way Viking society managed labor and wealth, because a household with enslaved workers could increase production, control more resources, and maintain status, and in long-distance trade, enslaved people could be exchanged for silver and goods in markets where demand existed, and this reminds us that Viking prosperity was not only built on skill and travel, but also on the exploitation of vulnerable people, which is part of the darker foundation of many historical economies. Trade centers also created cultural mixing, because when people meet regularly in markets, they exchange more than goods, they exchange language, fashion, ideas, and habits, and over time this mixing can change communities slowly, creating hybrid styles in art, new words in local speech, and new social practices, and this is one reason Viking influence can be seen far beyond Scandinavia. Because commerce creates soft influence that can last longer than a single military event. Another key effect of trade was the gradual growth of towns, because sustained commerce requires gathering points, storage, protection, and craft specialization, and while much of Scandinavia remained rural, some areas developed stronger urban-like centers during the Viking Age, where people lived closer together, where markets operated more regularly, and where political leaders could more easily collect taxes or control trade flows, meaning that the Viking Age contributed to the long-term development of more organized states and economic structures. The everyday life of a trader was not always adventurous, because much of trade involved waiting, measuring, negotiating, and maintaining trust, and merchants had to assess the quality of goods, the reliability of partners, and the dangers of travel, and a successful merchant would often be someone who knew how to avoid unnecessary conflict and how to move through different social environments smoothly. And this kind of quiet intelligence was as valuable as physical strength, even if it was less celebrated in heroic stories. By the end of this part, the calm conclusion is that Viking expansion was supported by an economic system as much as by weapons, and silver, markets, and trade routes created a flow of wealth that connected Scandinavia to regions thousands of kilometers away, and even though raiding remains the most famous image, trade was the steady background process that built long-term change, turning the Viking Age into a period of connection, exchange, and slow transformation across multiple continents. Viking warfare is one of the most famous parts of the Viking Age, but it is often shown in a very loud and dramatic way, as if every fight was an endless heroic battle, when in reality most violence in that era was usually short, practical, and based on simple goals like taking control of a place, forcing an agreement, protecting property, or gaining advantage in a political dispute. And because people wanted to survive, many conflicts were shaped by caution, timing, and local conditions, rather than by uncontrolled chaos. The Viking warrior image is often built around heavy armor and extreme brutality, but the practical truth is that equipment depended on wealth, because not everyone could afford high-quality gear, and many fighters were ordinary farmers who fought when needed, meaning a large part of Viking military strength came from organized groups of normal men with basic equipment. And this makes sense in a society where war was not a full-time profession for everyone, but an activity that appeared during certain seasons or moments of political opportunity. The most common weapon associated with Vikings is the axe, and this is not because axes were magical or unique, but because axes were useful tools in daily life and could also be effective in combat, meaning they were affordable and familiar, and different kinds of axes existed, from smaller hand axes to larger fighting axes, and the choice depended on a person's wealth and role. And even though swords became the symbol of elite warriors, axes were likely more widespread because they were easier to obtain and maintain. Swords were valuable, not only because they required skill to produce, but because good iron and steel were costly, and making a strong blade was difficult, so a sword often represented status and long-term investment, and in many cases swords were named, inherited, or treated as important property, which tells us that a sword was not just a tool, it was also a sign of identity, reputation, and social rank. And this is why archaeological finds sometimes show high-quality swords placed in graves as symbols of a person's standing. Spears were also extremely common and practical, because they were cheaper than swords, easier to make, and useful in many situations, and a spear can be used for thrusting, keeping distance, and supporting group formations, meaning that in many battles, spears probably played a central role even if they are less glamorous in popular imagination. And when we think calmly about pre-modern warfare, the spear is often one of the most efficient weapons available to ordinary fighters. Shields were essential, because a shield offered protection that made survival more likely, and the typical Viking shield was usually round and made of wood with a central grip and a metal boss, and while shields could break, that did not make them useless, because even temporary protection can decide whether a person stays alive, and Viking combat depended on shields not only for defense but also for the structure of formations, because group coordination often mattered more than individual strength. Armor existed but was not universal, because mail shirts and helmets required resources, and while some warriors owned them, many did not, and this means that protection often came from shields, movement, and staying within a group rather than from heavy armor alone, and it also means that battles could be risky and uncertain, because one mistake could end a fight quickly, which again encourages a realistic view where most people fought carefully rather than recklessly. One of the most important tactical ideas in early medieval northern warfare was the shield wall, a formation where fighters stood close together with overlapping shields to create a defensive front, and the reason this mattered is because it reduced vulnerability and made it difficult for an enemy to break through easily, and once both sides formed stable lines, the battle could become a slow pushing contest where discipline and endurance mattered, and this kind of fighting is very different from the chaotic individual duels shown in movies, because it is more about holding position and maintaining cohesion. In such formations, leadership was important, because men needed to trust that the people beside them would not run away, and trust in battle is not automatic, it is built through social bonds, reputation, and leadership, and Viking leaders often gained authority through success, generosity, and the ability to organize men effectively, meaning that the social world of gifts, loyalty, and reputation directly affected military performance, because a leader with loyal followers could keep a formation steady when fear and pressure increased. Raids, which are strongly associated with Vikings, often relied on speed and surprise rather than on open battle, because surprise reduced resistance, and resistance created risk, and risk could destroy an expedition, so a successful raid would typically avoid long fights and instead focus on arriving quickly, taking portable valuables, and leaving before defenders gathered. And this is why many raids targeted areas with low defense, because the goal was profit with minimal cost rather than glory through difficult fighting. When Vikings fought larger battles, the reasons were often political rather than personal, because large battles usually happen when groups compete for territory, control of towns, tribute systems, or authority over local populations, and in these situations Vikings sometimes fought other Vikings as well, because internal conflict existed in Scandinavia and in overseas settlements, and political disputes could create violence even among people with shared culture, showing that Viking warfare was part of power competition rather than a simple war against foreigners. Another important part of warfare was logistics, because an army cannot function without food, equipment maintenance, and planning, and even if the army is mobile, it still needs supplies, and this is why controlling a region could matter more than simply winning one fight, because controlling a region gives access to farms, stored food, and local resources, and in the Viking Age, groups that could secure winter bases and reliable supply systems gained a long-term advantage over groups that only relied on quick seasonal raids. The experience of fighting itself was probably stressful and uncertain, and while some people may have sought reputation through conflict, many others likely fought because they had to, because they were defending home, following a leader, or protecting family interests, and even for raiders, the decision to fight was often practical, because a wounded or lost fighter was not only a personal tragedy but also a loss of labor and strength for a small community, meaning that war was costly, and cost shaped decisions in a quiet, rational way. Weapons and tactics were not static, because contact with other societies influenced Viking warfare, and as Vikings encountered Frankish forces, English defenses, and other groups, they learned and adapted, and over time strategies changed, with more fortified towns, more organized resistance, and more complex political agreements, which gradually reduced the effectiveness of simple raids and pushed Viking groups toward settlement, diplomacy, and local rule. The later Viking Age also included the rise of stronger kings and more centralized authority in Scandinavia, and as kings gained more power, warfare could shift from smaller local conflicts to larger campaigns controlled by royal leadership, and this change had long-term consequences, because it moved Viking society toward state formation, taxation, and organized military systems, meaning that the Viking Age was not only about war abroad, but also about political transformation at home. By the end of this part, the calm conclusion is that Viking warfare was not constant chaos or endless heroic dueling, but a mixture of practical raids, disciplined group fighting, political campaigns, and careful decisions shaped by risk and reward, and the weapons and tactics were effective not because Vikings were mythical, but because their society supported mobility, loyalty, and coordination. And because in a world where travel was difficult and communication was slow, the group that could move quickly and stay organized could influence history even without being the largest population on the map. When Vikings first appeared around the coasts of England, the encounters were often sudden and violent, because early raids focused on speed and surprise, and English communities near the sea were not always prepared for attacks arriving by ship, but over time the Viking presence changed, and what began as seasonal raids gradually became longer occupations, repeated visits, winter camps, and eventually settlement. Meaning that the story of Vikings in England is not only a story of destruction, but also a slow story of migration, negotiation, conflict, cultural mixing, and the transformation of political power across generations. To understand why England became such a central focus, it helps to remember that early medieval England was not a single unified country in the modern sense, because it was divided into several kingdoms, including Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, East Anglia, and others, and each of these kingdoms had its own leaders, internal conflicts, alliances, and rivalries, meaning that when an external threat arrived, the response was not always coordinated, and if one kingdom suffered, another might remain temporarily stable, and this political fragmentation created opportunities for Vikings, because a divided land is easier to pressure, easier to negotiate within separate pieces, and often easier to conquer in stages. In the early phase, many Viking groups treated England as a place to take wealth and leave, but as time passed, larger and more organized forces began to appear, and instead of small raiding crews, England saw bands that could include many ships and many fighters, and these groups did not always return quickly, because they began wintering in England, establishing camps, and using local resources to survive through colder months. And this was a major turning point, because once a Viking force could stay through winter, it meant they could plan longer campaigns, learn the land more deeply, and pressure rulers continuously rather than in short bursts. A famous concept often mentioned in this context is the Great Heathen Army, which is a term used by later tradition and some sources to describe large Viking forces that arrived in England and began capturing territory during the 9th century, and while exact numbers are hard to confirm, the strategic impact is clear, because large Viking armies could defeat local forces, take control of towns, and force kings into difficult decisions, and once Vikings held territory, they could demand tribute, control trade routes, and settle groups of people who were no longer just visitors but long-term residents. The process of Viking conquest in England was not always smooth, because Vikings faced resistance, and local leaders fought back when they could, but the pattern often repeated in a slow way, with a Viking victory creating a temporary advantage, then local counterattacks creating uncertainty, then new Viking arrivals strengthening the invaders again, and through this long pressure, some English kingdoms collapsed or lost independence, and other kingdoms survived by adapting, negotiating, and building stronger systems of defense and government. Among the English kingdoms, Wessex became particularly important, because it was one of the main centers of resistance against Viking expansion, and one of the most famous figures associated with this resistance is Alfred the Great, King of Wessex, whose historical reputation has been shaped both by real achievements and by later storytelling, but even when we remove dramatic exaggeration, Alfred's period still matters because it represents a moment when English survival depended on strategy, organization, and long-term planning rather than simply on winning one battle. Alfred's struggle against Vikings was not a simple heroic story where one man defeats an enemy forever, because the situation was unstable and dangerous, and at times Viking forces gained major advantages, and at times Alfred's position looked weak, but his long-term impact came from persistence and from reforms that aimed to make Wessex harder to break, meaning that instead of relying only on brave fighting, Alfred's approach involved building stronger defenses, improving response speed, and increasing the state's ability to survive repeated pressure. One of the most practical changes often associated with Alfred's reign is the development of fortified towns, sometimes called buzz, which functioned as defensive centers that could slow or stop Viking movements, protect local populations, and serve as bases for counterattacks. And the logic behind these fortifications is simple and calm, because Vikings were strong when they could move freely, raid quickly, and avoid being trapped. So the best way to reduce their advantage was to create defended spaces where local forces could gather, where supplies could be stored, and where Viking attacks would become riskier and less profitable. This shift in defense strategy mattered because it changed the nature of Viking activity, since early raids depended on easy targets and weak resistance, but fortified networks meant that Vikings would face stronger barriers, and when a raiding economy becomes less effective, groups must either increase force, change targets, negotiate payments, or settle into more stable patterns of rule. And in England we can see all of these adjustments happening over time, as Vikings and English rulers repeatedly tested each other's strength and searched for workable solutions. While wars continued, Another key feature of Viking presence in England was settlement, because many Vikings did not only come as fighters, they came as people who intended to build a new life, and settlement could happen after conquest, after agreements, or after long periods of presence, and once a group settled, the relationship between Vikings and local English communities became more complicated, because daily life required cooperation, farming, law, trade, marriage, and shared survival. And a settled Viking population does not live like a raiding crew, because it must care about harvests, long-term security, and stable local order. The term Danelaw is often used to describe the regions of England that came under strong Viking control and influence, especially in the north and east, and this was not simply a line drawn on a map overnight, but a broad zone where Viking political and legal influence became part of everyday life, and within this area, Viking settlement patterns shaped towns, land distribution, local customs, and even language. And the name itself suggests the idea of Danish law, but the reality was more mixed, because the Danelaw became a space where Norse and English practices blended over time. In the Danelaw, Viking settlers established communities that produced agricultural output, and they also participated in trade, because England offered resources, markets, and strategic locations, and Viking settlement could lead to the growth of towns where commerce increased, and in such towns, daily life would involve both Scandinavian and English cultural habits, including different styles of naming, different forms of household organization, and sometimes different legal traditions, and this blending is one reason Viking influence remained visible long after major battles ended, because culture is carried through the quiet repetition of daily habits rather than through dramatic events alone. Language changes are one of the strongest signs of Viking settlement in England, because when people live together for generations, they borrow words, simplify communication, and shape each other's speech naturally, and Old Norse and Old English were related enough that basic understanding was possible in many cases, and as communities mixed, Norse vocabulary entered English, especially in everyday terms, place names, and practical words connected to farming, law, and daily objects, and this influence remains visible in English place names ending in elements that reflect Norse settlement patterns, showing that Viking presence was not just temporary occupation but demographic reality. Legal and administrative changes also matter, because Viking leaders needed systems to manage land and people, and local assemblies and dispute resolution practices could combine with existing English structures, and in many places the aim was not to destroy everything but to control it, because a ruler gains more wealth from a functioning region than from a burned ruin, and this is why many Viking rulers eventually became administrators, collecting tribute, managing alliances, and supporting trade, rather than simply being raiders forever. The relationship between Alfred's Wessex and Viking-controlled regions was not only war, because diplomacy and agreements were part of survival, and treaties could be made that recognized boundaries and created temporary peace, but peace in the Viking Age was often fragile, because leadership changed, ambitions returned, and new armies arrived, meaning that agreements were sometimes pauses rather than permanent endings. Yet even pauses mattered because they allowed rebuilding, farming, and the slow strengthening of institutions that made future resistance possible. Over time, the idea of English identity became stronger partly because of Viking pressure, because external threats often pushed smaller groups to coordinate more, and as Wessex continued to resist and expand influence, it could present itself as a center of unity against outsiders, and this political narrative helped it gain legitimacy, attract loyalty, and justify expansion into other English regions, meaning that Viking invasions indirectly contributed to the long-term process of political unification by forcing survival through organization. Viking leaders themselves did not remain static, because once they controlled territory, they were pulled into the local world of English politics, and they had to think like rulers rather than like raiders, and ruling requires stability, predictable income, and local support, meaning that Viking authority increasingly depended on administration, alliances, and social integration. And in many cases the children and grandchildren of Viking settlers became culturally mixed, with identities that were neither purely Scandinavian nor purely English, but something new created by living together. If we focus on everyday life in Viking-controlled England, we see routines that are not dramatic, because a settled community is built on farming cycles, property boundaries, local disputes, trade days, and family life, and in this environment Norse and English farmers would work the same soil, face the same weather, and deal with the same practical problems, such as protecting livestock, repairing buildings, and storing food for winter, and this shared reality tends to reduce cultural distance. Over time, because survival forces people into cooperation even when memories of conflict remain. Trade in England also benefited from Viking networks, because Vikings were already part of maritime routes across the North Sea, and a Viking-controlled town could become a connection point between Scandinavia and England, allowing goods like wool, metalwork, weapons, and luxury items to move across regions, and these flows created wealth, which further encouraged settlement and stability. Because trade profits are easier to maintain in peaceful conditions than in constant destruction. Religion is another area where Viking settlement created slow change, because early Viking settlers often followed Norse religion while local English society was Christian, and this could create tension, but over time conversion often occurred, sometimes through political decisions by leaders, sometimes through marriage and social integration, and sometimes through practical pressure because being Christian could offer advantages in negotiation with neighboring rulers, and as conversion spread, religious difference became less severe, and Viking descendants could become part of Christian England without losing all Scandinavian cultural memory. This gradual conversion process matters because it shows how Viking presence became normalized, and once leaders and communities shared religion, the difference between Viking and English could become less intense over time, turning old enemies into neighbors, and this is often how long invasions end, not through total destruction but through absorption, adaptation, and the slow fading of sharp boundaries. Despite these blending processes, conflict did not disappear, because Viking ambitions returned again in later periods, and England faced further invasions and political struggles, including later Danish kings who sought control of the entire country, meaning that the Viking story in England has multiple waves, and the early settlement era is only one part, but it created the foundation that made later events possible. Because once Scandinavian networks existed within England, later armies could find support, information, and local allies more easily than they could have in a completely foreign land. Even so, the main long-term transformation is clear and calm, because the Viking Age in England moved from shock raids to sustained presence, from seasonal violence to settlement and law, from fragmented kingdoms to stronger centralized resistance, and from cultural separation to cultural mixing, meaning that the Vikings did not simply attack England, they became part of England's population and history, and this process reshaped land, language, politics, and identity in ways that lasted for centuries. By the end of this part, we can summarize the English story in a steady way without drama, because the Danelaw was not only a zone of conquest but a zone of everyday life where Scandinavian settlers and English locals lived through ordinary routines, and Alfred's resistance was not only about battles but about building systems that could survive pressure. And over time the conflict produced new political structures and mixed communities, creating a world where the Viking Age was not only a period of fear but also a period of transformation through long-term contact. When Vikings began appearing in the regions that we now call France, the pattern looked similar to what happened elsewhere in Western Europe, because early encounters were often raids focused on quick wealth, but over time the situation became more complex, with repeated attacks, political deals, long-term settlements, and eventually the rise of new communities that were no longer simply Vikings visiting, but groups building permanent lives inside the Frankish world, and this long process helped create one of the most famous Viking legacies in Western Europe, which was the formation of Normandy. To understand why the Frankish lands became such an important target, it helps to remember that the Frankish Empire, especially under Charlemagne, had once been a powerful force, but after Charlemagne's death the empire gradually fractured through internal divisions, inheritance disputes, and competing political interests, and when a large political structure becomes divided, it often becomes easier for outside forces to exploit weaknesses, because local rulers focus on rivals as much as on defense, and resources that might have supported coastal protection get pulled into internal struggles, meaning that Viking groups did not have to defeat a single united enemy, but could instead take advantage of a landscape of competing authorities. The geography of the Frankish regions also made them vulnerable in a specific way, because major rivers like the Seine and the Loire functioned like open corridors into the interior, and Viking ships, with their shallow draft and flexible movement, could travel far upriver, reaching towns and religious centers that were not directly on the sea, and this created a sense that danger could appear deep inland without warning. Because in a world where rivers were primarily used for trade and transport, few communities expected them to become highways for fast military raids. In the early stages, many Viking attacks in the Frankish world were seasonal, because crews would arrive during warmer months and then return home, but the pressure gradually increased, and as Viking leaders became more familiar with the routes, they could plan deeper attacks, coordinate larger groups, and sometimes remain for extended periods, and this repeated contact changed the political atmosphere. Because the Frankish rulers could not treat Viking raids as rare accidents anymore, they had to treat them as recurring crises that demanded long-term solutions. The Frankish response often included military defense, but also payments, and these payments are sometimes described as tribute, because rulers would offer silver and goods to persuade Viking forces to leave, and while it might seem strange to pay attackers, the logic was often practical, because repairing a destroyed town, rebuilding a burned monastery, and losing agricultural production could cost far more than a payment, and the payment could buy time for a ruler to deal with internal political problems, build defenses, or prepare a stronger military campaign. From the Viking perspective, tribute payments were attractive because they offered wealth with reduced risk, and risk mattered in any pre-modern expedition, because even a small number of casualties could weaken a group badly, and if a leader could gain silver without fighting through a fortified defense, it was rational to accept the payment, and this created a pattern where Viking leaders learned that negotiation could be profitable, which is one reason Viking behavior in the Frankish regions often shifted between violence and diplomacy depending on circumstances. Over time, Viking groups in the Frankish world did not only take wealth, they also began shaping politics, because repeated raids forced local rulers to make promises, break promises, seek alliances, and shift resources, and the constant pressure could weaken certain regions while strengthening others, meaning that Viking actions did not exist outside the political system, they became part of it. And this is how long-distance raiding can transform into political influence, because every raid changes decisions, and every decision changes the future balance of power. One of the most famous Viking raids in the Frankish context was the attack on Paris in the 9th century, which became symbolic because Paris was not just a random village, it was an important place, and the idea of Vikings reaching and threatening such a center showed how far the river routes could carry danger, and even when a raid did not permanently capture a city, the fact that it could threaten it was enough to shape political decisions for years, because rulers had to consider the possibility of return, and communities had to adapt to the new reality that the river could bring both trade and attack. As defenses improved, rulers sometimes tried to block river access using fortified bridges, stronger garrisons, and organized local response systems, but these defenses required coordination and money, and coordination was difficult in a fragmented political environment. So even when strong defensive ideas existed, implementing them consistently was a long and imperfect process. And during this slow evolution, Vikings continued to appear, sometimes breaking through defenses, sometimes avoiding strong points, and sometimes simply choosing easier targets elsewhere. In many cases, the long-term solution that emerged was not total military victory over Vikings, but controlled settlement, because if a ruler could transform a raiding force into a local defensive ally, it could stabilize a vulnerable region, and this logic led to one of the most important agreements in the Viking Age in Western Europe, where Viking leaders were granted land in exchange for providing protection and loyalty, and this arrangement helped convert dangerous outsiders into semi-insiders who had a reason to defend the territory rather than attack it. This is where Normandy begins to appear as a concept, because what eventually became Normandy started as a region that received Scandinavian settlers under agreements with Frankish authority, and over time these settlers became established, built communities, and created a political identity that was both Scandinavian in origin and Frankish in structure, meaning that Normandy was not simply Viking staying, but a gradual blending of language, law, religion, and political culture, where the descendants of Viking settlers became something new. A key figure often associated with the foundation of Normandy is Rollo, who is described in later tradition as a Viking leader who negotiated with the Frankish king and received land along the Seine, and while the exact details of early Norman formation can be debated in scholarship, the general pattern still stands clearly, which is that a Viking leadership group gained territory, took responsibility for defense, and gradually became integrated into the Frankish world, and this integration created stability that reduced random raiding in that specific region, because the settlers now had farms, towns, families, and long-term wealth to protect. Settlement changes everything in a calm and simple way, because a raider's life depends on quick movement and short-term gain, while a settler's life depends on stable production, predictable seasons, local order, and relationships with neighbors, and once Viking groups settled in Normandy, their daily routine shifted toward agriculture, administration, and local rule, and their leaders had to behave like rulers who wanted the region to function, because a functioning region produces taxes, trade, and political legitimacy, while a destroyed region produces only emptiness. Over generations, the cultural transformation became even stronger, because the children of settlers often grew up speaking local languages alongside older Scandinavian speech, learning local customs, and forming marriage ties with surrounding populations, and even if family stories preserved memories of northern origins, the reality of daily life pulled them into the rhythms of Frankish society, meaning that being Viking slowly became less like a separate identity and more like a historical origin point inside a new regional culture. Religion played an important role in this transformation, because the Frankish world was Christian, and Viking settlers who wanted legitimacy and stable diplomacy needed to fit into that system, and conversion to Christianity, whether sincere, political, or both, helped Norman leaders become recognized within the broader European order, and as churches gained influence, old pagan practices faded, and public identity became increasingly Christian, which made the Norman population more acceptable to neighboring rulers and helped reduce the sense that they were permanent outsiders. Language also shifted quietly over time, because a ruling group that wants to manage a population needs communication, and the everyday reality of trade, law, and administration pushes people toward the dominant local language, and in Normandy that meant Romance language influence became strong, and while Scandinavian elements remained in place names and some vocabulary, the overall linguistic direction moved toward integration with the surrounding world, showing again how settlement turns cultural difference into cultural blending. The Norman story is important not only because it ended some Viking raids in one region, but because it created a new power center, because once Normandy became stable and organized, it produced leaders and warriors who were part of the European political system, and these leaders did not remain passive, because they learned the methods of Frankish feudal society, built castles, organized cavalry forces, and formed alliances, and this development eventually led to Normans playing major roles far beyond Normandy itself, including in England and southern Europe in later centuries. From a boring history perspective, the most interesting part is that this huge transformation did not happen overnight, and it was not caused by one single battle or one magical agreement, but by many years of repeated raids, political payments, defensive experiments, settlement decisions, and slow social adaptation, and when you look at history this way, it feels less like a sudden dramatic movie and more like a long administrative process where leaders make practical choices under pressure. And those choices gradually reshape society. It is also worth noticing that the Frankish world adapted to Viking pressure in more than one way, because some regions strengthened defenses, some regions paid tribute, some regions negotiated settlement, and some regions suffered repeated damage, and these different responses created uneven outcomes, meaning that Viking influence was not identical everywhere, and the long-term effect depended heavily on geography, political stability, and local leadership, which is why Normandy could become a strong organized region while other areas remained unstable for longer. Even after settlement began, not all Viking activity ended immediately, because the broader Viking world still existed, and other raiding groups could still appear, and political rivalries could still lead to conflict, but the creation of settled Viking-led regions represented a major shift in the Viking Age. because it showed that Viking expansion could produce permanent political structures rather than only temporary violence, and once a Viking group becomes a ruling class, it begins to behave like other ruling classes, focusing on land, inheritance, legitimacy, and long-term power. By the end of this part, the calm conclusion is that Viking activity in the lands that became France began with river raids that shocked communities and pressured rulers, but the long-term outcome was not only destruction, it was transformation, because the Frankish political system responded with tribute, defense, and settlement agreements, and these agreements helped produce Normandy, a region where Scandinavian settlers became integrated into the local world and created a new identity that would later play an even larger role in European history, meaning that one of the most famous Viking legacies in the West was not a single raid, but a slow process of becoming local. The Viking story in Ireland and Scotland follows a pattern that begins with fast coastal raids and then slowly develops into something more permanent and complicated, because these regions offered both wealth and strategic routes, and their coastlines, islands, and river mouths created many access points for seaborne groups, and once Vikings became familiar with the geography, they could return repeatedly, establish bases, build towns, and eventually become part of local life in a way that lasted beyond the first violent encounters. Ireland in the early medieval period was not a single unified kingdom, but a landscape of many small kingdoms and rival groups, and power was often local and contested, and this created both vulnerability and opportunity for Vikings, because a fragmented political system can struggle to coordinate defense, and rival rulers might even seek Viking support against each other. Meaning that the Viking presence in Ireland was shaped not only by Viking choices, but also by Irish politics that could turn outsiders into temporary allies in local disputes. The earliest Viking raids in Ireland, like in other parts of Europe, often targeted monasteries and coastal sites, because monasteries held stored goods and precious items while having limited military defense, and the raids created fear and disruption, but they were not always large campaigns at first, and many would have been small groups looking for quick wealth, and after taking what they could, they would return to the sea, leaving local communities to rebuild and to worry about the next possible attack. Over time, however, Vikings began to spend longer periods in Ireland, and the shift from seasonal raiding to longer occupation mattered greatly, because a group that remains for the winter must find stable resources, and this usually means establishing a protected base, and once a base exists, it becomes easier to launch repeated expeditions, to store goods, to repair ships, and to negotiate with local rulers. And this is how Viking presence becomes durable, because durability is not produced by a single victory, but by the practical ability to survive in a foreign land through the cold months. One of the most important long-term Viking impacts in Ireland was the development of towns and trading centers, because Viking groups established coastal settlements that grew into urban-like places, and among these, Dublin became one of the most famous and influential, and the reason this matters is that Ireland before the Viking Age had many monastic centers and royal sites, but it did not have the same style of large trading towns that developed in some other parts of Europe and Viking town building introduced a different kind of economic structure where long-distance trade and dense settlement patterns became more important. Dublin began as a Viking settlement and developed into a hub where goods moved in and out through sea routes, and it connected Ireland to Britain, Scandinavia, and wider European markets, and town life created new routines, because in a trading center people focused on craftwork, buying and selling, ship repair, and the storage of goods, meaning that Viking influence was not only military, but also economic and urban. And once a town grows, it becomes a permanent feature of the landscape, shaping surrounding regions long after the original founders are gone. Viking involvement in trade in Ireland also connected to the wider Viking economic network, including the movement of silver, crafts, and sometimes enslaved people, and while it is uncomfortable to discuss, slavery was part of the Viking Age economy across many regions, and Ireland became part of these networks, meaning that raids could produce captives who were sold and exchanged. And such practices added another layer of suffering to the era, because the Viking Age was not only about politics and ships, but also about the human cost paid by ordinary people who were caught in conflict and commerce. As Vikings settled in Ireland, the relationship between Vikings and Irish populations became more mixed, because settlement requires interaction, and interaction leads to trade, alliances, and marriage, and over generations people can become culturally blended, and Viking settlers could adopt Irish customs while Irish people could adopt Norse practices, and the result was not a simple separation between Vikings and Irish, but a shifting set of identities that changed with time, region, and political circumstances. The Viking Age in Ireland included periods of intense conflict and periods of relative cooperation, and this rhythm is important because it shows how unstable political situations can be, with one generation experiencing raids and battles while another generation experiences negotiated peace and shared markets, and in such conditions communities adapt, building defenses, creating alliances, and sometimes accepting new rulers if resistance becomes too costly, and this slow adaptation is part of how Viking influence became woven into the structure of Irish life in certain regions. In Scotland and the surrounding islands, the Viking pattern also involved both raiding and settlement, and the geography of Scotland made Viking movement especially influential, because the coastline is complex and includes many islands, and islands can serve as stepping stones for travel, bases for control, and places where seafaring cultures naturally feel at home. And Vikings moved into regions such as the Northern Isles and parts of the Hebrides, where they could establish long-term presence and shape local communities in lasting ways. Island life during the Viking Age often depended on maritime routines, because fishing, coastal travel, and small-scale farming were central, and a community on an island could be both isolated and connected, because the sea separates it from the mainland but also provides routes to many other places. And this means that Viking settlers in island regions could maintain contact with Scandinavian networks while still becoming part of local cultural environments, creating hybrid societies that reflected both northern origins and local realities. The Orkney and Shetland Islands are often associated with strong Norse influence, and in such regions Norse language, place names, and cultural elements became deeply embedded, and even long after the Viking Age ended, the cultural memory of Norse settlement remained visible, because when a population lives in a region for many generations, the names of locations, the structure of local law, and the pattern of land use can preserve historical influence in a quiet way that survives political change. In Scotland itself, Viking groups interacted with local kingdoms, and the results could include conflict, alliances, and shifting control of territory, and because early medieval Scottish politics involved multiple groups and competing rulers, Viking participation could become another factor in local power struggles, meaning that Vikings were not always simply an outside enemy, but sometimes a force that local leaders tried to use, resist, or negotiate with depending on what increased their chance of survival and dominance. What makes the Viking story in Ireland and Scotland especially interesting in a slow, boring history style is how much of it becomes ordinary daily life over time, because once Vikings settle, they raise families, farm land, manage property, trade goods, and argue over legal matters just like everyone else. And the dramatic raids become only one part of a wider system where the real historical change comes from settlement patterns, the creation of towns, and the gradual mixing of populations. The development of trading towns and the growth of maritime networks also changed what power looked like, because control of a port and its surrounding trade could produce wealth that supported armies and political influence. And this is why places like Dublin became central, because a wealthy town can finance leadership, attract merchants, and influence regional politics. And over time these economic centers can shape the direction of wars and alliances more than isolated battlefields do. Because they provide resources that sustain long-term action. Religion also played a role in cultural mixing, because Irish society was Christian, and Viking settlers came from a pagan tradition initially, but over time conversion occurred in many places, often through political decisions, social integration, and the desire for legitimacy, and as Viking leaders became Christian, it became easier for them to negotiate with local rulers and participate in the wider European Christian world, and this conversion process helped reduce cultural barriers and created new forms of identity where Norse origin did not automatically mean religious separation. The Viking influence in Ireland and Scotland also affected language and names, because place names preserved settlement patterns, and Norse terms became embedded in the geography, showing where Vikings settled, traveled, or controlled land, and the mixing of languages and cultures created regional variations, meaning that Norse influence was stronger in some coastal and island areas than in inland regions. And this uneven distribution of influence is a reminder that history is rarely uniform across an entire country. Over the long term, the Viking Age in Ireland and Scotland contributed to the creation of new political structures, new towns, and new cultural layers, and even if conflict remained, the legacy was not only destruction, but also the development of maritime trade systems and settlement communities that continued shaping the region after the age of raids had passed. Meaning that Viking history here is as much about building as it is about attacking. By the end of this part, the calm conclusion is that the Vikings arrived in Ireland and Scotland as raiders and outsiders, but over time they became settlers, traders, and local rulers in certain areas, building towns like Dublin, shaping island communities, mixing with local populations, and leaving behind cultural traces in place names, language, and economic patterns. And when we step back from the dramatic moments, the most important changes happen slowly, through repeated contact in the everyday routines of people living side by side across generations.